we don't know exactly what we carry over. We're not quite sure what we carry over, but I think we do, in a sense, carry something. There is something there. What does it matter if the dead come back and want to speak? So what? I was a young teacher in New York, and I had this experience when I was standing in my kitchen, and I was doing the dishes. It was quite late at night, and I was really very relaxed, and my mind was kind of drifting, and I was very, happy. And I saw something out of the corner of my eye, and I turned my head, and there was this ghostly form. And it really shocked me because it kind of woke me up, and it really shocked me because I didn't understand it. And so I was very distracted, and the next day I went to work, and some of my colleagues were greeting me and could tell I was a little distracted, and this friend of mine said, what's going on? And I said, I just saw something last night. I saw this really interesting thing. And these moments in your life when you can tell that your life has taken a different turn. And what she said to me literally turned my life in a different direction. And I was very sensitive because I was expecting her to say, you're tired, lots of things can happen when you're overtired. Your mind can play tricks on you. And she didn't say that. And I was expecting her to say that. And she said, who do you think it was? And it was that question that allowed me to open up, this possibility that it could be a someone as opposed to some issue with me. And so really that moment really took me to kind of a different direction. At that time, then I started exploring quite a bit about that particular incident. And I moved to London at that time, also in a teaching job. And the city of London really had an effect on me. I felt that there were very friendly ghosts in London. And I had a lot of experiences when I first moved there that I couldn't explain. One of them was I had a dream. And I was doing a lot of self-reflection and a lot of work on myself and living on my own and learning how to meditate and calming my mind. And so I had this dream of being on a bus and seeing the bus driver and seeing the girl across from me with a scarf and a very specific pattern and a hat, and the guy next to her with the beard, and the guy next to him was holding a novel and was reading. And I looked at the title and I thought, I think that's Lolita in the dream. And so I woke up and I thought, well, what's that about? Okay, where is my life going, and who could these different people be? And I was like analyzing this dream for the significance of what it meant for me. And so the dream kind of disappeared out of my day, and I kind of went along and started getting ready for work, and something happened and I needed to hop on a bus that I don't usually hop on. And so I hopped on this bus and I sat down and I got the weirdest physical feeling. And I looked up and there was my dream right there, the bus driver, the girl with the hat and the scarf, the guy with Lolita. And I thought, well, that is weird. What does that mean? That's kind of interesting. So these were very perplexing experiences for me because I was not sure what was happening, and I was not sure what my mind was doing, whether these things were happening to me or whether I, on some level, was looking for them. And I really spent a lot of time weighing these up. During this time, I had a very good friend who was in Paris, and we spent a lot of time together, back and forth, traveling. And one weekend, I was in his apartment, and I really didn't know where I was in Paris. I mean, I knew my way around, but I didn't know the specific neighborhood. And we were having dinner and very relaxed again, and talking about just everyday things. And I got this overwhelming sensation. And it was a 360-degree sensation, if you can imagine. It was smells and tastes and visual. And he looked at me, and I said, I've just had this overwhelming sense of being in Victor Hugo's France. The smells were very specific, the smells in the street, and the sounds were very specific. And that just came out. It wasn't me thinking about what it was. I just said, it feels like Victor Hugo's France. And he looked at me, and he stood up and walked across the room and pulled back the curtains, and he said, Victor Hugo lived in that apartment across the street. So again, I was, this is strange. These things keep happening, or what's happening, So I spent quite a bit of time searching and reading a great deal about the visionary tradition mostly in religious traditions, and talking to people about their experiences, and also trying to find a teacher who could help me, right? And in fact, I had found a Jungian therapist who actually suggested that I go check out the College of Psychic Studies in South Kensington. And this is I guess it has perhaps a little unfortunate name, the College of Psychic Studies, but this institution has been around since the 1800s, and it has a very long tradition of training people who have experiences like this. And so I was able to kind of find a teacher and start working on meditative practices that help me understand these experiences and specifically help me turn them off rather than turning them on. And so I learned really to try and train my mind to focus, so that it wasn't happening. These things didn't unfold and happen when I wasn't expecting them to. So about this time, I started reading Jung. And I remember reading Memories, Dreams, Reflections. I'll never forget that. In fact, I often find when I'm talking to groups, what did you think? I ask the question, what did you think when you first read MDR? And it's so interesting to see how that worked on different people. And for me, I was so taken by the fact that here was a man who was having these experiences and who was so committed to articulating them in the best way he could, and was really wanting to understand in some kind of framework why they were happening. And so I thought, this is actually very interesting. Maybe, and the fact that he talked about the dead so much, he's not talking about other symbols in his material. He's not, and I've said this before, he's not talking about clowns, he's not talking about bears or camels, he's talking about the dead. And he's talking about other figures of the unconscious, and he's discerning the difference between the two. Here was a framework to explore, to understand not only what was going on with me personally, but also my academic interest in this ancient facility what the ancients had access to in terms of a visionary process, and other religious traditions that accept the visionary in quite a pedestrian fashion. And so by this time I had moved away from London. I do remember I was in an apartment in London. I lived in an apartment, and I knew it was haunted. I knew there was something there. And it didn't really bother me. The whole situation didn't really bother me. I was just very aware that there was another presence there. And so one day I asked, who's here? And I got a very specific vision of a little boy with blonde hair. And I thought, well, isn't that interesting? Because the apartment I lived in was the attic flat in the school where I worked. And so I thought, well, why would a ghost, stay around here? So I went and asked someone who had worked in the school for many years and said, do you ever remember of a child that went to school here who passed? And she said, yes, there was a little boy. And she pulled out a picture, and there was a blonde little boy. So, these things, these kinds of experiences were happening to me daily, And so at that point, I really was looking for some, not just a framework, but some grounded place to discuss these. Now, at the same time, some of the people I did try and reach out to the psychological community. I did try to find a therapist. One of the first counselors I met, I was starting to talk to her about some of these things, and she said, do you really believe that this is happening? And I thought, well, there's no support here. I'm not going to be able to explore what I need to explore because my reality is changing here, and it is changing at a faster rate than I'm able to mentally and intellectually track it. So I'm going to really need to find help and someone to help me figure this out. And so it was the people at the College of Psychic Studies were really able to give me some grounding. And then the intellectual part was pursuing Jung. Now, at the time when I was ready to leave London, I also felt that there was, not only was I leaving London after many years, but I was going into a different stage of my life. And I was starting to get flashes and visions of that while I was preparing to leave. And part of that included a man. And I saw him very clearly, and I had a sense very clearly of what kind of person he was, because he was in finance. And I thought that was hilarious because I had never even ever thought that I would be involved with someone in finance, because it just didn't even remotely intersect with anything in my life. So I went on a very long traveling trip. I went to India. I got to Australia. And I was in Australia for about 3 days. And my brother-in-law, who lived in Australia, said, I want you to meet this friend of mine. And kept at it. You really need to meet him. And I was kind of distracted, not really interested. And then he went ahead and set something up unbeknownst to me, and I walked in, and there he was, the guy that I had, these flashes of this man. So again, after many of these experiences, I started to trust what this was about. And eventually I married this man, and I talked to him many years about the Aeneid and this evolution in my perception of my life and myself and the world that I interact with. And at one stage he said, you really need to contain this. I think you should get a PhD. I think you should go and find someone and really study this. And so it was very interesting how that unfolded. I managed to find a supervisor who was willing to take me on. And I said to him, I'm very interested in, maybe starting with the Aeneid. And he recommended really diving into Jung a bit more after Memory Streams. And I was trying to do a Jungian treatment of the Aeneid for my thesis. And I needed more Jungian framework for it. And the more I read Jung, the further away from the Aeneid I got. And I remember saying to him, I think I'm going to have to leave Aeneas on the other side of the sticks so that I can dive in and keep going with the dead. And I started with what I call the 5 death dreams in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, that are the principal dreams that he had before his confrontation with the unconscious. And I wrote these up, and during this, my supervisor and I were having this conversation, the red book's coming, right? When is the red book coming? And my supervisor did know Sham Dasani, and I said, can we ask him, when is it coming? And so other things were happening in my life. I was starting a family, and I asked to have time off. I'd written 2 chapters, and I asked to have time off, and I said, I need a little bit more time. I need that book to be published, because I think I know what's in it. There's going to be stuff in it about the dead, and it's going to help clarify what I think's going on with Jung, what I think he was experiencing. And so I took this break for 18 months, and during that time, the Red Book was published. And I said, okay, give me 6 months, and I think I can get through it and write it up. And of course, it took me 3 more years just to dismantle the Red Book. So I think also that this other kind of evolution that's occurred in my development of understanding how these experiences happen has also been assisting other people with who have non-ordinary experiences. And so I've worked with several people who also have visions and have sightings, and so I assist them in being able to make meaning of it for themselves. And often it's about building skills to be able to manage being a sensitive. And I found that to be quite satisfying, in terms of being able to help. At this stage, from an academic perspective and from a personal perspective, I think I live those questions differently, right? Because I need to foster a different way of talking to the academic community about these experiences. I met this wonderful gentleman at a conference, at a Jungian conference, and I had presented a poster presentation on the Aeneid thing, and what I was doing was matching scenes of this book 6 of the Aeneid with passages from Jung that actually complemented in kind of a spooky way all the way through. And this lovely gentleman came up to me and said, can I ask you something privately? And often people do. They'll come and they want to kind of come quietly and share. And he said, my wife died about a year ago, and I've been seeing a Jungian analyst, and she appeared to me, and it was very emotional when she appeared to me, and I took this to my therapist, who said, basically, this is a projection. And I felt what he was saying to me was that interaction, calling it a projection, lessened the meaning for him. It reduced it to something that he couldn't reach anymore. And so what he wanted to ask me is what I thought the experience was. And I said, what do you think it was? He said, I think it was my wife. I think she wanted to visit and check on me, and it was wonderful. And I said, then that's what it was. That's what it was. And that made meaning for him. And I think we need to look at, when we're looking at the energetic process of death and our relationships to death, we treat them as a separation, obviously. And when people have these experiences, there is a coming together of that separation. There's a fusion of sorts that's very healing. And I think spending some time looking at how we help people manage these, grief, basically, is a very good place to spend time, because I think we've been doing it wrong. James Hollis, in his book Hauntings, actually recommended to a grieving father talk to your deceased son every day. Talk to him. And I think that's one of the wisest things I've heard as a prescription, to be honest, since I've been studying this path, really. We have to kind of change the way we think about this and engage in building a different kind of relationship. And that's very important. What is this? What could it be? And this is also a very difficult thing because our language is limited, all right? And the language that we use to describe something so IMAX, 360 degrees, falls so short when you're trying to share it with someone. And people feel a sense of disparagement when they can't relay how important, how life-changing these experiences are. And I remember, about 3 or 4 years into this journey, thinking, it was as if I was standing on a cliff and I was going to jump off. And I remember thinking, if I step over this line to accept the way I'm experiencing my life, there's no backtracking. I won't be able to go back to the way I used to live. And I will need different structures and different ways of thinking to manage my life. And I remember how scary it was. And it was just me changing my mind, literally, but it shifted my whole axis of the way I experienced my life. And so, for instance, where some people would say, gosh, I wish my friend would call, I haven't heard him for a while, I send a message to my friend and say, you know what? And this is like a psychic message. I say, you know what? I haven't heard you from a while. Could you please call? And we've done this so many times, within 12 hours he'll call, just right away. So I think it's, when you say what are these experiences? First, I think the experience is about living with what Jung would say a timeless and spaceless psyche. That you accept that the world isn't as bound in laws as you think, and that the psyche exists in this place where you can function differently. About that time at the College of Psychic Studies, I had a very good teacher, and part of learning to know your own self is being able to shift and pick up information from others. And so part of that, it was training and learning how to do that, being sensitive to your environment and being sensitive to people. This idea of walking in a room and there's an argument that's just happened, learning how to read a room even when there's no people in it. These were some of the skills that we learned how to do. And so I was incredibly reserved about getting into that work, partly because it's not respected. It's, you might as well be a pole dancer. No disrespect to our pole dancers by any stretch of the imagination, but, there is this, it's not accepted. We don't have a bridge, we don't have a language that helps bring, frankly, what used to exist in our Western tradition that we've forgotten, that we've pushed to the shadows, there's no structure that helps bring it back. I think the timing of my birth and my development actually is the timing of, coming out of the 60s, out of the age of love and the new age. And I grew up in the new age. I grew up with that language of self-development, self-help. And so that community is always very welcoming and a comfortable place to be. But I really wanted to be able to explain what I see happening. And it's not unique to me. I'm not built any differently than you or anybody, really. I just happen to be having these experiences on a regular basis. So my mediumship work, I trained to become as proficient as you can with a very good set of teachers. And I didn't do anything with it. And I just kept, refining it for myself and refining it for myself, practicing on people, but basically for myself. And then my first trip, I went to India, and then my first trip to Australia, I stepped off the plane, and the clarity of the air, the clarity of the energy in Australia, it was as if someone plugged me in. And I remember being off the plane for about a day, and all I had were saris, because I'd been in India for several months. I didn't have any clothes. So I went to a mall and went looking for clothes, and managed to find myself, I was wandering around, found myself in one of these crystal stores, and overheard that they needed someone as a reader to do readings for people. And I said I could do that. And I sat down and I did that for 2 years straight, just do. And part of that process for me was incredibly important, because I needed to affirm and confirm that what I was practicing, that there was an element of truth to it. I mean, I felt that I was showing up in integrity and truth and being of service in this way. Is the psyche a closed or open system? Now, if you fall on the side that's a closed system, then this is a very difficult conversation to have, because it doesn't fit anywhere, right? But if you consider yourself, more apt to engage in the open system, then there's all sorts of possibilities. I just read a book last week by an academic from my alma mater at Kent, Peter Moore, and his book is Where Are the Dead? And his suggestion is a really great one, which is, we've been considering this in terms of being incarnate or discarnate, being in the body or not having a body. But why can't we consider an existence of consciousness that's still embodied, but that it doesn't have a body? So that it has a form, okay, that after whatever's going to leave the body at death leaves, that this sense of being embodied actually has some kind of form. So why can't we pursue that line of thought? And it's a very interesting proposition. The first two laws of thermodynamics. Number one, energy cannot be created or destroyed. And number two, it simply changes forms. Now I'm paraphrasing, obviously. But that alone assists in you understanding that there is a shift. There's not a dissolution, right? I mean, sometimes in my mind I think, well, you could apply those laws to what's happening at death. I asked a physicist once, what do you think happens? And he said, I think the energy is absorbed by other organic things like the trees, and absorbed into the air, and just in that way, and not disappearing, being destroyed. How can we prove any of this? At this stage, and I think one day we will be able to, and maybe one day soon, but right now we can't prove that if someone says they're talking to the dead, that they're actually talking to the dead. Because the issue is, how do you discern that you're talking to the dead, or that the information you're getting from the dead isn't information in the psyche of the individual? And that's a very difficult thing to prove. But there are researchers who are trying to do that, designing experiments that would tease out this difference. So I think that's another approach. But I also think that this is a very difficult subject to broach with someone who at least hasn't had an experience that they couldn't explain. This is, I think, the fundamental basis of it is that you have an experience that your rational mind and the education that you've had up to the stage, and the commitment to a rational argument and reasoning, that you can't manage to apply that to an experience that you've had. And I think just having one experience that you can't explain often opens the possibility that there could be a whole lot more you can't explain.